Thank you. My name's Tim. I'm an alcoholic. Wave if you can hear me. Good. Hello. So, um, I haven't seen. There are some of you I've not seen before. So, just FYI, I've been sober since the 24th of July, 1993. So I've got just over 27 years. Um, I'm not an authority on anything. Um, in the words of Margaret Atwood in one of her novels. Um, She talks about a character who doesn't know her arse from a hole in the ground, and there are days when I'm like that as well. So, just bear that in mind uh, when I present what experience I have of the concepts. And I've served at all levels within the fellowship, including conference. I've not been on the General Service Board, but I have been on a subcommittee to the General Service Board. Uh, what I say is my view. I may change my mind before lunchtime. So if you disagree with something, that's absolutely fine. No one need get exercised about anything, and I get a lot of things wrong. But literally the first thing I said today was wrong to the person I live with. So there we go. So looking at concept two, we've got, as usual, the World Service long form, the World Service short form, and the Great Britain concept. Of course, our concepts are different. But I'm going to read the World Service long form. I don't think there are any Brits here, or if there are, they're heavily undercover. So the World Service long form. When, in 1955, the AA groups confirmed the permanent charter for their General Service Conference, they thereby delegated to the conference complete authority for the active maintenance of our world services, and thereby made the conference, excepting for any change in the 12 traditions or in Article 12 of the conference charter, the actual voice and the effective conscience for our whole society. Now, I think you'll probably agree that's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? I wouldn't be able to memorize that and report it back easily. One point about the concepts, because not everyone was here last week, uh, in more senses than one, maybe. The point of the concepts is this: they're in the context of the steps, the traditions, and the concepts. Each performs a different function, and one way of looking at it is I get unity within myself. All the conflicts are resolved through the steps. I get unity with you in groups through the traditions, and the concepts are how we get things done in AA. So if AA is a worldwide fellowship, there are some things that we need to do that cannot be done at group level. Telephone services, publishing literature, um, responding to requests, say from the press or from the government. So we need to get things done. How are we going to do that? The concepts provide the answer. So historically, they set up this alcoholic foundation uh, in the late 30s to run those joint services. So that was on one side. On the other side, you had uh, the fellowship, and there was Bill and Bob in between, mediating between the two. The conference replaces Bill and Bob. So what we have now is this chain of delegation going from the fellowship through the groups to the GSRs to the conference delegates who produce the conference. Now the conference is therefore the voice of AA as a whole, that the ultimate authority and final responsibility for AA World Services does reside. Who's responsible for our literature? Well, it's you and Susan and Bobby in your home group. That's who's responsible for the literature. However, if you want to get a new pamphlet published, it's no good trying to coordinate, all of the AA members in the country to do it. You can't do it. You need some sort of centralizing channel. Um, and the channel is these lines of communication to conference. So conference is the vehicle, the vessel where the entire fellowship expresses its views. And this is still part of the overview. I'll get into some detail in a minute. Conference expresses its views, conference makes recommendations, it makes decisions. But it can't do anything. It has no hands and feet. It's just a sort of big brain, really, with a voice. For anything to be done, it needs to be implemented, and that's where the General Service Board come in, that's where their corporations come in, that's where their subcommittees come in. So in the material realm, the major decisions of policy and finance are made by conference, and they are implemented by the General Service Board through its various operations. But one's always got to remember that the conference is not acting on its own behalf, it's acting on behalf of the fellowship. So let's get into some of the detail. Concept 1 said that final responsibility and ultimate authority resides in the groups. However, it's hamstrung. The groups are hamstrung if they don't delegate. So you're sitting in your group, you think, well, we'd love a new pamphlet for atheists and agnostics in AA. There is nothing you can do sitting in your group about that. You need to delegate that idea, the responsibility and authority, to something else which can move ahead and implement that idea. So the reason we've got this structure is to enable this chain to be established. If you think about if groups tried to communicate with each other on a new pamphlet, can you imagine how the 4,500 groups in Great Britain would do that? Each would have to write to each other one. There is no way of having real dialogue. There's no way of achieving consensus. There's no way of making decisions. There's no way of acting. So conference is the venue in which the groups can effectively communicate with each other, dialogue can be elaborated, consensus can be achieved, and decisions can be made. And then amazingly, when I'm at conference, it's amazing that you have a topic on which the fellowship as a whole has disagreed vehemently, and yet you have this remarkable vote where there are 110 people voting, and 104 are in favour of the proposal and 6 against. Discussion, vote, and substantial unanimity reflecting the will of the fellowship as a whole. So that's how it works. Now, you don't go directly from your group in wherever you are, Blacksland, wherever that is, to conference in, is that even a place? You don't go in one stage. In Great Britain, there's this great big dull chain which goes from the groups to the conference. So the groups elect the GSRs attend intergroup, the GSRs also attend London Region North Assemblies, that's where the 6 delegates are chosen, and those delegates attend conference with delegates from all of the other regions plus the General Service Board. In other countries with more sense, you also have the employees of the of AA attending conference and voting at it, but not in Great Britain anymore. That's a whole other question. So what does conference even discuss? Now, as I said, conference doesn't really originate anything itself. What it encourages the fellowship to do is to submit questions. If you've got a topic, submit it. If you have a question, submit it. And then the steering committee sifts those, selects a number of those questions and topics it wants to answer, or it thinks it's suitable to answer, but responds to everyone. So the reasons why it rejects topics and questions are published as well in full, so that there's complete transparency. That's not always been done, by the way. So a few months before conference, the 15 to 18 questions are published and distributed to the fellowship as a whole. Each group holds its own little group conscience meeting to discuss them. It's not deciding anything, it's just presenting its views. So when the GSR takes those views up the chain to the delegates, it reports the minority view. It doesn't just report, the GSR doesn't just report what the majority in the group thought. GSR reports what everyone in the group thought. These views, this is how it works in London. These views are then presented to the delegates at the Assembly, who take copious notes, which they hopefully can read afterwards, and furnished with this cacophony of voices from the region, we attend the committee meetings and pour out those views into the committee meeting where the topic is discussed and the recommendation is made. So all of these delegates tip up at York in Great Britain, representing the 16 regions, with a number of people from each region, 6 from each region. And they draft recommendations in their separate committees, and then those recommendations get presented to the fellowship as a whole at a so-called plenary session. That just means the full session with everyone there. They get presented. They go back and forth in various ways. I won't go through the full conference procedure here. It's most of you are not British, so it's not relevant. But basically, we hash it out amongst ourselves. Feedback goes back and forth. Recommendations get rewritten. People's objections and quibbling and finagling get incorporated into the recommendations somehow, and we come up with a final draft. It's presented to conference, and either conference goes for it, yay, or it doesn't, yay. So it doesn't matter if the answer is no and something is thrown back. We'll talk about things being thrown back a little more in concept 3, so with right of decision. But to put it very simply, if conference doesn't feel it's able to make a decision, it gets to report back to its delegating authorities, that's the GSRs. It can consult anyone who is affected. It can ask for more information. It can commission expert reports. It can do all sorts of things. But anyway, conference writes out all of these recommendations. They're voted on. The ones that are passed then either go back to the fellowship for implementation at group level, or they go on to the General Service Board for implementation at the level of the fellowship as a whole. So a good example of both. A recommendation to a group might be how we handle violent people at meetings, right? So those recommendations is not an act of government. It's just saying, here are some good things that we've done, that we've learned. There are some things which work. Do what you want, but these things often work. What you've got with the General Service Board is actions which can only be taken at that level. So it might be, for instance, the production of new videos for public information. So going back to this idea that the whole fellowship has got responsibility and ultimate authority, as I said last week, Bill uses lots of synonyms. Don't get hung up on the synonyms. So he says final responsibility and ultimate authority. Final and ultimate mean the same thing here. So there's no point in trying to. It's like with shortcomings and defects. You know, what did Bill mean? Well, he didn't mean different things by it. And this final responsibility and ultimate authority has got 2 elements. The first one, imagine within your group, these 2 elements are present within your group. There's the conscience, and then there's the resources. The conscience can be likened to knowledge of God's will for us in step 11. And the resources is the power to carry that out. If you had a car, the knowledge is the information on the satellite navigation system, the destination telling you where you're going. The resources is the car and the petrol in the engine. So you've got two elements of of responsibility and authority. You've got the conscience and the resources, but it needs to delegate these to conference, and this is what gets delegated on to the executive bit, the General Service Board. Another way of looking at the same thing is, and this is how it splits out in the later concepts. With any endeavor, you've got two elements of it. You've got the major decision making. Again, that's like the knowledge of God's will for us. And then you've got the action, and that's the power to carry that out. At the level of the fellowship as a whole, it's the conference that makes the major decisions of policy and finance. The action is then taken by the General Service Board and its various authorities. Contained within this concept, in combination with the first concept, they really go together. It's like the first concept says the fellowship is the brain, and the second concept says that the conference is the body. A brain without a body isn't much use, and a body without a brain is even less use. You need both working together. And the body is the trusted servant of the brain. That's how it works. So the delegates, as I said earlier, they're serving the whole fellowship. And this is an important point actually with the delegates. They're not merely the slaves of the groups who elected them. As soon as they go up to conference, although they've been sent by a bunch of groups somewhere, when they arrive at conference, they're making decisions. They're not fighting the corner of that bunch of groups. They're making decisions. They're representing Alcoholics Anonymous as a whole. That's the weight, that's the burden which is resting on the shoulders of the delegates. They're serving the whole fellowship, not just the corner that voted them in the first place. There's a principle in the concept that one mustn't have, as they call it, double-headed management. If ever you've worked in an organization where two people think they are your boss, you'll realize what a catastrophe this is to have two bosses who don't talk to each other. Whatever you do, someone is going to be upset. So there is only one master here, and that's the higher power. And the higher power expresses itself through three channels when you're a delegate at conference. The first one is the voice of the groups. That all happens way before conference. Then there's the voice of the other delegates. So at conference or in any decision-making forum, the job is to not just present your views, but to really listen and absorb the views of the people around you. And then the inner voice of your conscience. So although there's only one master, the channel of communication, there are multiple channels of communication. Now, because there are multiple channels of communication, so the groups who appoint the delegate in the first place, as I say, they're not appointing the delegate as this slave. The delegate, I'm going to talk more about this next week in Concept 3. The delegate is an intelligent agent. And so the delegate has got to be trusted by the groups. Now, I don't know what AA is like where you are. Not everyone one meets in AA is entirely trusting at all times. Not everyone is entirely trustworthy at all times either. Sometimes people have a tiny little bit of trouble letting go and trusting someone else. Many years ago, or a few years ago, the conference decided that there was going to be a pamphlet for atheists and agnostics, and they called it the God Word. And it was such a roaring success. I think they sold at least 2 or 3 dozen copies that I think it's been adopted in America now. I may be wrong on that. A friend of mine in Boston was contacting me about that a couple of years ago. But it's a jolly good pamphlet. I'm not atheist or agnostic myself, but I sympathise with the predicament, and so I think it's a very good thing. But I tell you, where uh, you got off lightly, simply in other countries, just taking that pamphlet and adopting it and passing it at conference. You should have seen what happened here in the writing of it. So who's going to write that pamphlet? Who writes that pamphlet is the people on the literature committee. We delegate the job to them. You should have seen the micromanagement which people tried to exert from group level, as though an individual group could be the voice of AA as a whole. Or level confusion, what in A Course in Miracles it calls level confusion. We've got to trust the delegates. The delegates have got to trust the board. The board have got to trust their committees. You can't micromanage things or nothing will ever get done. Now, the fact that the delegate has his or her own conscience means the delegate may have to vote against the majority view from the delegate's own region. This is right and good. We're going to come on to more examples of how and when that arises under right of decision next week. It's very difficult that you can't put bulkheads between the concepts. They all form a single working mechanism. So you talk about one part, it automatically invokes many of the others. Now, there's nothing wrong with the delegate deciding against what the groups suggested, but the delegate does have to account back to the groups at the regional assembly or the area assembly, whichever structure you have. And it's then up to the, let's say it's a regional assembly, not to attack the delegate, but to listen to why they voted against the majority view of the region. And if they don't like it, if the region doesn't like it, if it's bad enough, they can replace the delegate, get a different delegate in future. But the job is not to break the delegate down and destroy them and tell them off for being a very, very naughty boy. One's got to respect the fact that there may be valid reasons. One may disagree with those reasons, but to disagree at that level without being disagreeable. You can't delegate without things sometimes going differently than you planned them to go. If you're not, as Bob B says, if you can't lose, you can't play. If you're not willing to accept that things may go differently than the way you anticipate, don't delegate in the first place. Keep it all to yourself. But that won't achieve anything either. So, fortunately or unfortunately, this whole process involves a huge amount of compromise and recognizing that I think it was Felix Frankfurter who said there are matters on which reasonable people of goodwill may disagree. And lots of issues at conference are just such matters. I've gone to conference with terribly strong views, disastrously strong views, and then heard the other regions speak and be dumbfounded that I could have been so blinkered, but I needed to hear it from the human beings in the room. What else? I think that's all I've got to say on the application of concept 2 in its strict sense in the context of the fellowship. But, and this is where, to me, the concepts become enormously interesting, is that they're sets of principles to be applied in my life. And in particular, my service of the higher power. So this is all of this stuff. I say this every time, but it needs to be said. Anything I say, I've learnt either from experience or more chiefly from other people who are smarter than me and more experienced than me. I'm just passing this on. That's all I'm doing. So in my life, might you say I've got it wrong already? It's not my life. I made a decision in step 3 to turn my will and my life over to the care of God. So the life that God delegates back to me, God has the final responsibility and ultimate authority. I only have delegated responsibility and authority. You ask my customers, you ask one of my employers, you ask my, the mortgage provider for the home that I live in, who's in charge? They'll say, you have final responsibility, you have ultimate authority. Secretly behind my hand, I'm saying, no, I don't. The higher power does. So I might look in my actions to the outside world that I've got final responsibility and ultimate authority, but it's a ruse. I have delegated responsibility and authority. And there are two elements, as I said earlier: major decision making. That's concept 6. Knowledge of God's will for us, and action, the power to carry that out, the resources to carry that out. And here's the great thing. I don't need to derive the decisions or the resources myself. I can go to God for both. And this idea is enshrined in step 3 in the big book, where it says, God provided what we needed, provided we stayed close to him. That's the decision making, and performed his work well. And like a good employer will provide the employee with the tools necessary, the resources necessary to do the job. And the result of this is a feeling of complete weightlessness. That's the natural state. When people have got lots and lots of multiple fractures or have been very badly burned, sometimes they're suspended in these cooling gel tanks, completely weightless. And that's the ideal. If I'm feeling any weight or burden, something has gone wrong. I'm bearing some element of final responsibility and ultimate authority in my life. If I feel heavy, it's because I'm carrying something which is not mine to carry. God's supposed to carry the entire burden. I'm only given, when you're small and you come back from the shops and your parents are weighed down by all the shopping and you get to carry one tiny little carrier bag with an egg in it or something. That's all you have to. All I have to do is carry, as it were, the egg of the moment. On eggs, 2 points. The Welsh author, Alice Thomas Ellis, said that for her, the irrefutable proof of a divine creative intelligence in the universe was the versatility of eggs. Eggs could not possibly be that versatile without there being a creative intelligence behind them. My friend Patry, who lives in the Canary Islands, I wish I did. When she was new in AA, she was very, very gung-ho about things in AA. And they said to her, some people thoughtlessly said to her, Patry, you shouldn't put all of your eggs in one basket. She said, I understand, except I've only got one egg. And this is true in all sorts of senses, but the chief sense is this. At any given time, I only have one egg to carry. That's the thing that I'm doing right now. The thing which is appointed to me in this present moment. And that is always doable. When I look at very complex situations I've had to deal with over the years, when I was at the beginning of the 2000s, the finance director of one of the dot-coms, if anyone remembers those, and the hell they put lots of people through, not least their own employees. I was the finance director of one of these dot-coms, and we weren't doing badly. We were only losing £250,000 of other people's money per month. I mean, it was only £250,000. It could have been a lot worse. Very complex situation. But what it breaks down into is one action at a time and being present in that one action. And each of those one actions is doable. If it's not doable, it's not mine to do. Isn't that wonderful? So if I can't do it, it's not my job to do it. It's clearly outside my scope. I'm only ever given to do what is doable. And if I can't do it, I can consult with others. I can ask others. I can report back to God saying, I can't do this. If you want me to do it, you're going to have to show me how. You're going to have to give me the resources. Over to you. So all I have to do is show up. I used to wake up in the morning. Used to. That makes it sound like years ago. This is more like days ago. Um, I used to wake up in the morning with this terrific sense of but the burden of all of the tasks to be done that day. I've got a very complex life with lots of moving parts and lots of things to do. And if you're familiar with the Greek myth of Sisyphus, Sisyphus was condemned for eternity to roll a stone up a hill, and when it got to the top, it would roll down the other side. Some smart Alex said it didn't roll back down the other side. His wife pushed it. But anyway, that's an aside. And so he's got the labor of the day at the beginning of every day. The stone is back at the bottom of the hill. And if I feel like that, if I feel Sisyphean, I've got something wrong because I can't do tomorrow's laundry today. Have you ever tried to do tomorrow's laundry? Have you ever tried to do the laundry of clothes you haven't even washed? You can't empty ashtrays unless there are cigarette ends in them. Whereas I can feel the weight of all the ashtrays I have to empty or the laundry I have to do or whatever. And I'm trying to carry something which is not mine. So I'm dosed actions one at a time by the higher power. There is also, I think, the sense if God gives me things to do, I'm not doing them on my own account. I'm doing everything on God's account. My job is on God's account. My family relationships are on God's account. But here's the interesting thing. If God is omnipotent, God could have achieved his objectives in a different way. And yet, for some reason, we appear to be here. We appear to have been chosen, therefore, to do certain tasks. There is that phrase, we are God's voice, hands and feet. And I think that's not bad. If you were brought up in a French household, I was brought up in a French household. If you were brought up in a French household, you'll be familiar with the phrase, you don't linger. When you're a child in a French household, don't mill around, don't linger, because you'll be given something to do. This is just how it works. If you want to do nothing, hide. Because if you mill or loiter, one of the adults will say to you, puisque le bon Dieu t'a mis là, since the good Lord has put you there, you might as well go and whisk these. It's usually something to do with eggs. Go and, collect the eggs, whisk, separate the eggs, whisk the eggs. There's always like eggs at different stages. This is a French household. That's how you know it's a French household. Even if they're not speaking French, there are eggs everywhere. But the point is, if I'm here, it's to do something. There is a purpose. There is a purpose, but I don't need to know what the purpose is. I need to know what the action is, and I leave the purpose to God. Who knows what the purpose is? Because to know that, one would have to see all of the ramifications of one's actions to the end of time, and that can't be seen. Concept 2 contains within it the sense of serving only one master, being when something is delegated to you, you serve the delegating authority, the fellowship as a whole. If I'm serving only God, that means I've got to say no to ego requests, and I've got to drop the other addictions. One point about that. For a long time, I thought I will start doing God's will when I feel comfortable. I'll start doing God's will when the compulsions go away. I'll start doing God's will once I've got everything taped down. Then I'll be able to devote myself to doing God's will. It turns out it's the other way around. It talks in Bill's story about self-sacrifice. What does it say? sacrifice of the price, and that's it. The price, a price had to be paid, the destruction of self-centeredness, and Bill talks about self-sacrifice elsewhere. Now, if I'm distracted by sex and money and power and prestige and comfort and thrills and appearance, and yet in the midst of, still feeling the gravitational pull of all of those things, I decide to answer the sponsee phone call, to go to the meeting, to do the thing in service I said I would do when I said I was going to do it. It's painful. What I've learned is I can't wait to be comfortable before I do the service. I do the service, I prioritize that as an act of the will, which is the only real power that I have is what am I going to do with the situation presented in front of me? And I act first, and then I find that the gravitational pull of those ego desires fades as I realize I'm not sacrificing treasure. I'm sacrificing burden and fear and frustration and all sorts of other terrible things. But in the moment that you start to let go of those things, it won't feel like that. It will feel like your innards are being pulled out of you. It will feel like your toys are being taken and thrown on the bonfire. Which is why I used to poo-poo this. We say to newcomers, don't drink and go to meetings. And I used to poo-poo that. So, I went through many years of thinking that was absolutely right. Then I went through many years of saying that it's absolutely whiffle, we're powerless. But there is a point where I have to make a decision when I'm new to um, to not drink no matter what. However bad I feel, the decision has to be there. Now, I don't have to do that on my own. I'm given the strength through the higher power, through prayer, through the actions of AA, blah, blah, blah. But I've got to be willing to do that and go through that pain. If I'm willing to be uncomfortable for long enough, you know what? If you're anything like me, eventually you go back to God anyway, because there is nowhere else to go. Bill Cleveland talks about this. He went to his sponsor with a terrible problem, and the sponsor said, you have to go to God on this. And he said, can't you give me something more concrete, something more real, something I can work with? Give me something else. Don't give me this God crap. Give me something else. And the sponsor, who's about 5 foot tall, I've met him, said, there is nothing else. Now, you can't really tell anyone that. You kind of have to work it out for yourself by a process of elimination. There are points at which you just have to go straight to the higher power. You don't collect $200. You don't pass go. You just have to go, not take the pain away, because that will be to interfere with the laws of cause and effect, which will be more alarming than the pain in the first place. But to withstand the pain, and in withstanding it, it starts to dissolve. The curious thing, when you say to pain, come at me, come on, come at me, it's got nothing there. It's threat. Anyway, what this is about is how I've moved from being pulled in all sorts of different directions to really only wanting to go in one direction, which is to do the next right thing, do the next right thing, do the next right thing. Spiritual Paul used to say, it's better to be a God pleaser than a people pleaser. There's only one of him. So there's no conflict then. If I'm not trying to please myself, if I'm not trying to please my ego, if I'm not trying to please my lower impulses, if I'm not trying to please you, God bless you, but if I'm not trying to please you, there's no conflict. So although it looks like we serve others, this is where if you have an Al-Anon streak down your back, as Karen would say, I have an Al-Anon streak down my back. Serving others can become a false idol in itself. And one's got to remember that one's serving the ultimate authority. This is what you do as a delegate. You serve the good of the fellowship as a whole, not the loudest voice amongst the GSRs in your area or region. Although you're serving the human beings, that's the means by which you're serving God. which means you get to say no to stuff when other people request it, because in prayer and meditation, it comes to you that that's not, whatever it is not God's will. Single-mindedness, a phrase that Spiritual Paul gave me as well, was a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. I think that's from the book of James, which they almost called AA the James Society after the book of James. And the way to be single-minded is, if I put the action first, if I'm dedicated in action, the mind follows afterwards. I don't have to resolve the conflict first. I have to go to God and say, what do you want me to do? The 19th century preacher Charles Haddon Spurgeon said, don't be such a fool as to think you have to untie the knot before you go to God. You go to God to cut through the knot because you can't untie it. And that going to God to untie the knot is, you say to God, what do you want me to do today? Like literally today. Not what do you want me to do in the world? What do you want me to achieve in, those Stalinist 5, 10, 20 and 25-year plans that all those people on LinkedIn want you to devise for yourself as part of your sort of self-marketing strategy to conquer the world. Just LinkedIn, I have to be on there, but it makes me tired looking at those confident faces everywhere. Just, I don't identify. Where was I going with that? LinkedIn. Oh, you see, my mind is not quite right. Oh, that's it. You don't have to untie the knot first. You go to God, you say, what do you want me to do today? I don't need to work out the long-term destination. I just need to know what step to take today. And how that surrender manifests in AA is steps, traditions, and concepts, daily fellowship with other people on the same path, daily practice of pages 84 to 88 of the book Alcoholics Anonymous, being sponsored, sponsoring others, being of service in the world. And surrender is progressive in my experience. In some ways it's circular, in that you wake up every morning, and I don't know what happens to your mind overnight, but I have to collect the pieces of my scattered mind every morning. It's like a cat has got in there and just, there are bits that I don't even find until the next day. So something happens at night, who knows what. So I'm back at square, as C.S. Lewis says, you're back at square one every morning, in your relationship with God. Jim Willis, my first sponsor, would say that, and he's been sober since 1957, which I'll save you doing the math, 63 years. He says all of his experience over 63 years, if you imagine a globe, and he starts, those globes in old offices that people would have in, studies in stately homes, how far has he got towards the center of the earth? He's scratched the first layer of varnish in a couple of places. That's it. So in some ways this is circular. Do we ever make any progress? Who knows? But looking over any considerable period of time, it's progressive. And it has to remain that way. If I'm not going forwards, I'm going backwards. There's no such thing as stasis. A friend of mine says it's to do with entropy and the laws of thermodynamics, but who knows about that? What I know from my experience, if I'm not moving forward, I'm moving backwards. You find yourself, how do you know you're moving backwards? You start feeling the way you felt 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, wondering if anything has changed. That's how I know I've been moving backwards. And the last point, really, or set of points, there's a key phrase here, and this is, when you're the delegate, you've got a foot in two worlds. You've got a foot in the higher realm of the conscience of the fellowship as a whole, and you've got a foot in the practical matters which are being discussed at hand. And the image that was given to me is that the service that we do in AA is to be a channel for heaven to come down to earth, to take the sort of broken or incomplete parts of the world and to make them heaven-like. progressively over time. And I haven't got this from nowhere. It's actually enshrined in the Big Book along with other places. We have come to believe that he would like us to keep our heads in the clouds with him, but that our feet ought to be firmly planted on earth. Get it the wrong way round, you're in serious trouble. If your feet are in the air, you're not doing any, you may be doing something, but you're not doing anything useful. If your head is on the ground, it's not a safe place for your head to be. When I feel danger and threatened and under attack and the world is going to get me, my head is on the ground rather than in the air. Psalm 91 has this great line about the angels will lift you up on their palms so that you don't dash your foot against a stone. So it's that lifting up, yes, I've got to do practical things in the world, but that's not the be all and end all. I'm playing roles in this dream world of material reality, but I mustn't identify myself with those. My identity must remain in higher realms. Two catchphrases which have helped me. Spirituality without action is fantasy. Action without spirituality is lifeless. And I've experienced both. Have you ever done a great meditation in the morning and then the phone rings and you're back into your phone answering personality? And what was the point of even doing that 45-minute meditation? It's clearly had no effect whatsoever. You've got to bring the two together. An action without spirituality. A friend of mine says that on a bad day, he describes his life as an endless sequence of unfulfillable obligations. And that's action without spirituality. It's dead. And here's something which I find immensely helpful. Sometimes if you trust the eyes, which are in most people are placed in the upper part of the physical head, you might be forgiven for believing that the material world is basically what's real. And yes, there might be some sort of little higher realm that you access through glimpses in meditation or service or something else. But here, this is what's real. But it's the other way round. Um, uh, the higher world is not the oasis in amidst the desert. There's a novel by the French novelist Amin Malouf, where a narrator is visiting a monk in a mountain monastery. And the monk is an old friend of his. And he says to the monk, "Here it's an oasis," I said, for want of a less trite image. "No, it's the opposite," said my friend, correcting me firmly, as if he had already reflected on this comparison. "The world is an oasis, and here we are in the immense expanse that surrounds it. In the oasis, you spend your time loading and unloading caravans. Seen from here, the caravans are just silhouettes on the horizon. Nothing is more beautiful than a caravan when you see it from afar. But when you get closer, it's noisy, it's dirty, the camel drivers are quarreling, and the animals are mistreated." Now, if you feel that you're living, and I have moments like this, sometimes I feel I'm living in a world where it's noisy, it's dirty, the camel drivers are quarreling, and the animals are mistreated. For me not to go completely mad, I have to remember this is a fragment of reality. There's an Indian Jesuit called Paul Coutinho. They've all got Portuguese names, the Indian Jesuits, or most of the Spanish or Portuguese names. And he said the material reality is about 1% of reality. And I think that's right. Ralph Waldo Emerson talks about the same thing in his essay, The Oversoul. If you try and read it, either it will make total sense or you won't be able to get past the first sentence. If you can't get past the first sentence, read it anyway, put it away for a year, come back in a year's time. At some point it will click, but don't dismiss it. It's an amazing, amazing essay. So my job is not to fall for the optical illusion that the material world is the more real of the two worlds. A friend of mine describes the material world as a shadow cast on the wall by the hands which are obstructing the light. So as a delegate, I got to remember I'm not acting on my own account on that committee or conference. I'm part of this greater reality. I'm part of this greater whole in AA. And that's the principle that I follow in my life. When I remember that I'm part of a greater reality, almost nothing matters and the only thing which does really matter is responding to the next situation as my higher power would have me. There is a couple of questions here. In the UK, the 2020 conference has been postponed to 2021. I'm no longer a delegate for various reasons. I'm not available. I had to stop after a couple of years because I'm not available at the times the conferences are going to be taking place in the coming period. Do I agree with the decision that it's been postponed till 2021? Did your group area region get to talk to you about the thoughts on this postponement decision? What were the reasons for postponing? I think it's just that the reasons are very practical and very specific to do with the situation in the UK. I think my understanding, I'm not fully keyed into all of the thinking behind it. The conscience of the fellowship was expressed through the delegates who were informed by their regions, who were informed by their groups, was that people want to be in the same room looking at each other. They did not want to do it electronically. My experience of trying to do things electronically is they'll do in a pinch. But there was no single issue the conference was going to discuss that couldn't wait. The fellowship in the UK is pretty taped down. Within Great Britain, not the UK. The fellowship in Great Britain is pretty taped down. The things we get to discuss at conference are relatively low-grade issues. They're things which have been bumbling along for years, which, we might change this, we might change that. Can you give a picture of how Concept 2 was utilized when the pandemic took hold and live meetings closed? My understanding, certainly in my little corner of AA, is that groups continue to hold group conscience meetings. Those group conscience meetings inform the GSRs. The GSRs are still attending intergroup meetings. Region still exists. It still makes decisions. The London Region North website for Alcoholics Anonymous is one of the most amazing AA websites I've seen. Its responsiveness. It's now meeting. There are some online now. There are some which are face to face, and the way they dealt instantly with that sudden change. It's all working terribly well. So I'm pretty impressed with my corner of AA here. I've got nothing else on that. So unless anyone else has any questions, I'm going to keep my mouth shut. So back over to you, Gabrielle.